walk through the kind of the credo of the Second Renaissance. And in particular, I think it's a credo that, or a kind of statement that's also useful more broadly. One of the points here today is that, when Buddha, if you don't, maybe you don't know the story. So Buddha, basically he sits under the Bodhi tree and he gets finally kind of has liberation or enlightenment, and he goes back to find his friends. Actually, he's had these buddies, these ascetics, basically, that he's been wandering around with for quite a while, and who he's left because he's decided the ascetic path wasn't working, and he's teaching them, and he's kind of giving the first basically Dharma talk to his friends, telling them about his newfound insight. And I mean, we only obviously have reports written down hundreds of years later in the sutras of what happened. But he's kind of trying to teach the kind of core insights. And one of the core things he teaches is the Four Noble Truths, as it's called. You can tell that Buddha wasn't yet a postmodernist. He didn't say the Four Noble Opinions. He did say the Four Noble Truths there. So that's one for Buddha there. But the thing was that Buddha was, I think, trying to distill, well, there's obviously a very rich teaching in Buddhism, but he was using this metaphor of healing, and he had this, so he kind of distilled into these four elements, a very kind of simple medical analogy of the approach. And that's very helpful because in just transmitting often these quite complex ideas, if we have something quite simple that we can remember, now of course there's a lot of richness around it, but something simple, that's very useful. So today, that's what we want to go through a little bit, and the analogy. So first, and I want to look at is that, what does anyone know what like the first noble truth in Buddhism is? Just anyone want to kind of be bold, be the first person to come off mute and say something?
Suffering exists.
Suffering exists. Is that, Cullen? Is what you said?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So there's kind of dissatisfaction, suffering exists, is present, is kind of somehow inherent, at least in normal existence. To be clear, it's not necessarily normal, inherent in all existence, but there is suffering. This was the first noble truth that Buddha taught. And even that one's confronting, right? I don't know if you've ever had debates where there'll be people like, that's not true, or life isn't suffering, and it's not quite what Buddha taught, but this can itself be a difficult one to see, and to see that, there's often a view in our society even that, if only, I don't know, I'm Elon Musk, I don't know, if only I have all the money, or if only I get the job, if only I succeed in this way, I mean, I can see this in myself, in my life, then I won't suffer anymore. Suffering isn't inherent. It's just my right now. If I get somewhere one day, and Buddha was kind of saying, well, kind of normal, at least human existence, there'll always be this kind of dissatisfaction. Either I'm cold and I want to be hot, or let's say I even do succeed, I'll be worrying about losing what I have. There's this kind of inherentness of normal human existence. Now, what I want us to do here, we should get ready, Lauren, in a moment. We have breakout rooms of, I think, about 3 people that we'll come up to, is what I want to look today is what we want to look at in the Second Renaissance as the kind of first noble belief is that there is something kind of profoundly not working as well as we would like in our society. There is kind of a crisis or crises that are arising. And so what I want you to just to reflect on at the beginning here is most people, now maybe you don't think I mean, now I think it's kind of relatively common, at least in our area, that people think that, but not everyone thinks that's okay. But what I would wonder is, when did you notice that? When did you first notice that there was something kind of not working in our society? And what was it? So you were like, oh, maybe many people it might be the climate situation or the ecological situation, but for other people it might be something else. But what was it and when did it happen that you noticed? And now there's often I want to distinguish here also that there's kind of distinction between crisis. There are wars that go on. There are there is homelessness or these things we notice, but there's something a bit stronger than that. It's where you're like, oh, there's kind of something a bit more systematically problematic here. So what I would like you to do, if we set up the breakout rooms for three people, we have about 5 minutes at the moment here to start with, is just when did you notice there was something not working as well as you'd like it to, and what was it? Helpful. So what we're kind of walking through is that, you know, whether you've heard of terms like metacrisis or you've heard the term metamodern, or you've heard of integral, or you've heard of the Great Turning by Joanna Macy, or there's the Age of Aquarius, older, like there's this kind of sense of civilizational shift. Second Renaissance is a term that's being used here, but what I'm particularly goes on in this page, and it may not be obvious if you've ever seen this page before, at the secondrenaissance.net website, which there is this kind of analogy with the Four Noble Truths. So that's what we're going to walk through is the Four Noble Beliefs. And at the end of this, you should be able to tell me, or tell yourself, or tell others what parts of this page are which noble belief, and even which one is currently missing from this page, in fact. So and again, I say this a little bit because we've been, Life Itself, the organization I'm part of, been around a decade, actually as an organization, and we've been interested in these topics for longer. And one of the things I guess that we're very interested in, and you might also be interested in, is how to communicate some of these ideas more powerfully to your friends and family, to your acquaintances, or more broadly in society. Because at least in my experience, for example, these ideas aren't yet very common. The overall ideas. So, for example, I make the term, if I go around and ask people, have they heard of the term metacrisis? And they won't know. And even I would bet within Limicon, if I were actually go and give people like a survey and say, like, write out your definition of like metacrisis, or here's an essay question, and what's the difference between a polycrisis and a metacrisis? Um, you know, that would be kind of tough. It's like we don't yet have like that's emerging, those kind of understanding, but it's quite early in the movement. So in a sense, one of the things that was going on in this at least landing page, which we put a lot of time actually into, was to try and like distill it as much as possible, but not too much. Now, I'm not sure we succeed in that, and so on. But there's this attempt, and in the same way that Buddha was trying to maybe convey a very complex, experience or path, and use this kind of medical analogy, essentially, right? Which is, if you go back to it, there's an illness, there are symptoms, then there's a source of an illness, then there's like the possibility of a cure, and then there's the path to the cure. Like, what is the kind of way you go about it? So what I'm going to look at is, we've just been talking about this part, our world shows signs of serious illness. Okay, that's where we are. And I would call this the polycrisis. Crudely, I mean, you can be a bit crude, but I would say, in a sense, there are symptoms. Like, we see escalating series of interconnected crises, right? Ecological, political, and social, meaning, maybe a meaning crisis, maybe, a mental health crisis. We can see these, and we can see that maybe they interconnect in some way. That the political crisis is connected to the meaning crisis, like we're not going anywhere, or vice versa, or that the ecological crisis is related to the political crisis, or the economic challenges that we face. And there's also a sense that increasingly, I think, in our societies, which you can look at in like survey evidence, even actual data of what people are saying, that there's a sense things are quite serious. Things aren't going very well. Maybe not everyone, but there are certainly in people who I think look, there's debates. I forget how to skeptics, but the climate science or the ecological data suggests that there could be quite serious breakdowns in the biosphere in some ways. There's obviously existential risk that people talk about from AI or in other areas. But the thing that I would mention is that what's crucial is accurate diagnosis is vital. So what I would like, when people were sharing what we don't want to treat the symptoms. We want to look at what the underlying cause is. If I come along and I have a headache, maybe I just need an aspirin. Maybe I've just got a headache, or maybe I've got brain cancer and I really need to do something about it. Or you could, um, so that kind of underlying of the underlying, source of the illness is really crucial. So the thing here is, I would like to maybe just suggest a specific topic for a moment. So let's pick, I'm going to pick one because I think it's common, and maybe I hope for the moment this, well, if you feel that it isn't even a crisis, that might be a really good topic to debate in your breakout room in a moment. But I want to pick the kind of, I would call it the climate or ecological crisis. So the fact that we seem to be passing over certain, planetary boundaries, that we don't seem to be acting, I would say, that much on climate change, and we see impacts of that, wildfires, other actions. As I said, if you feel that's a topic debate, that would be a great thing to discuss in the breakout room. But my question really is, if you pick that one topic for the moment and focused on it, one immediate question just to ask in your room is, in that area, when did it become salient to you? Like I can, when I was at school, I was kind of aware of the climate crisis, but I thought, hey, tidal power will solve the issue, or solar, or we'll do something quite soon. This was in the late 90s or something like that, early 2000s. So when did it become like salient, like this is a crisis and this is not getting better? Like this has gone from being like, oh, we should do something about this, and we've got the Kyoto Protocol and surely it's going to get ratified or something, to no, it's not going to get addressed very quickly. But that should be quite brief. But the real question is, what do you think is at the source of it? So if you think that's a symptom, what's the source of the disease, metaphorically? So going back, Buddha says there's suffering. Okay, great, there's suffering. Maybe that's just inherent in human. No, and Buddha's the next noble truth is like the source of suffering. I'm going to teach you the source of that. So that's the question. You come in, and traditionally, right, all the doctors, particularly maybe even today it happens, but certainly in the past, like, no, they need to be bled. No, they need this, they need that. What's the actual source of the illness that this patient has? Everyone agrees that there are symptoms. And it's also important to notice which symptoms are important. For example, maybe wars are getting worse, but, humans have been carrying out wars. I'm not sure that's a key element of the poly crisis at the moment, for example, but I would say the climate crisis was. Now, I may be wrong about that, but I'm just trying to come to, and this is setting out one of the noble belief kind of number two, like, so the second noble truth. So you might have said, well, the source of suffering is we don't have enough Lamborghinis. You might have said that to Buddha. Buddha didn't say that. Buddha, in the second noble truth, says, well, the source of suffering is several things, but core is like this kind of idea of craving, of grasping, that there's this constant, in the normal condition of the human mind, there's constantly this grasping for something other than what is. And so the thesis in the second Renaissance, the second noble belief thesis, is that there are these core views and values to any kind of civilizational structure, right, that you're in, has some kind of core views and values, which we in second Renaissance call cultural paradigm. You could call it effective value meme. There's a variety of different terms people use. So these aren't just like, oh, in any culture there are certain like general views or things that are accepted or norms, but like really kind of foundational ones about the nature of reality, what's important. And these are very difficult to see normally, right? Because you're in them traditionally. When you're living in a culture and you're living even in a kind of civilizational paradigm, it's kind of invisible like water to the fish. And this breakdown, we would contend, like the poly crisis, like step one, these interconnected crises, the significant ones, are connected to a breakdown in our cultural foundations, like the things kind of at the root of our civilization. And we would argue that by these kind of views and values underpin the economy and the socio and economic structures. They, of course, interdepend, intercause each other, but these kind of core cultural worldviews are the base. We're not Marxists here. So they have, and they at a cultural level, which is in the paradigm of modernity. And the point here is that, for example, the climate crisis is quite specific in its nature. If you look at it in a certain way, that it's caused, for example, by, first of all, a technological capacity. Like we have immense technological capabilities. It wasn't like people weren't overusing things before, but they didn't have the capacity to overuse them at the scale that we can today, which is a function of our technological capacities, which is a function of the explosion of science and reason and other things. And we live in a kind of capitalist era, largely in the world, in which accumulation, and particularly material production accumulation, play a central role. In fact, kind of almost an ideological role, I would say. So these modern views and values are at the root of our crises. So these views and values like individualism, progress, rationality, freedom, and equality, which have brought, and I'm going to say this for my part, I think brought extraordinary material progress and advance in individual liberty, which were valuable. There are lots of good things about that. However, they now cast long shadows. Endless growth, materialism, techno-solution, and addiction to certainty and control are driving global exploitation, destruction of nature, nihilism, and loneliness, and an ever-widening wisdom gap. So by the wisdom gap, we mean the gap between our technological capabilities and our societal complexity and our ability to manage those. So this is the kind of the thesis here is that is the source, and this is what makes it what we'd call it this is the definition of a meta crisis. A polycrisis in which the roots of that crisis, there is the source of that disease is in the cultural foundations at the meta level of your society, makes it a meta crisis. That is the definition for us of a meta crisis. And so this also means that any solution, any path forward has to likewise go to those roots. We can't address the current crises through the logic and value systems that created and continue to drive them. In a sense, any solution has to be radical in the true sense of the word radical, which means radix in Latin, root. And we need profound shifts in our ways of being, thinking, feeling, and acting, the emergence of a major new cultural paradigm that transcends modernity. And I emphasize transcends. There are things we wish to take with us. We are not seeking to go back 20,000 years. We're seeking to kind of transcend and include and evolve. So the next question I would pose is, what do people think that new, if you think of the core worldviews and values of modernity, just let me bring that up actually for people. Well, so these are the core, I would say, like the five horsemen of modernity that you can see here, which is like progress and growth, rationality, secularity, individual freedom, and equality. Like those are five core kind of views or values that we could look at. There are more, but this would be a distilled set. What do you think if we're looking to evolve our paradigm, our cultural paradigm, what do you think the new one looks like? Now, you can describe it in like maybe behavior or actions or institutions, but even better if you can think of it in terms of views or values. Like what would we, rationality is good, but what would we maybe replace, what would rationality turn into? What would be the kind of core ways, what would we, instead of progress and growth, materially, what would we want to value or things like that? It doesn't have to be an exact mapping, but I'm just trying to give examples to provoke you in your thinking or to prompt you in your thinking of what would the new paradigm look like? What would be the core views and values there? So I'll leave this up, but we can, and I might paste it in the chat in a moment, but we're going to open the breakout rooms now for 3 people again, and we'll give people another, I think probably in this moment, we'll give them 7 to 8 minutes. Let's say 7 minutes. We might give you an extra minute at the end, but just take your time and really imagine with 50 years, 100 years, 500 years, whatever it might take for us in this new world, what would be those core views and values? What would we be doing? So just to spell that out, if from people who know that book, I guess you could say also it's built heavily on obviously integral and so on, would be that value was real. There was kind of there is the good in the world, not that any particular person has it, and there are ways to perceive the good. And And so that would be, but the core assumption would be maybe both of evolution and that there is the good. Maybe not in the classic way that might have been in traditional mythic religions, but in a more in a very real way. I don't know if I'm doing justice to it there. Um, Daryl, go ahead.
Yeah, to follow up on what you and Victor said, there's some sort of a decentralized awareness with governance and accountability built in that works a lot better than our current democracies work. But that somehow just happens or is in some field, in some emergent field that um, probably uses technology, but also doesn't rely on technology to hold this value of a holistic right-brained awareness that more and more people have and connect with. I don't know how you sum up that value.
Yes, I would maybe describe some of that as wisdom, like in the particularly the capacity maybe not only to sense the good, but then to act or sense it collectively and act on it. Very good. Carla, what would you like to share?
Um, Going off of interdependence, we would know that we are not individuals. We are not capable of existing without uh, the interconnections and the death of other things. So yeah, we're not able to do it alone. We are a part of a larger system, and knowing that, we would probably make different choices regarding the other entities in this system that
Yes, and I think that's beautiful. The kind of sense the term I think of, interdependence into being beautiful, Carla. And I think what I also heard in what you were saying was not only maybe the intellectual apprehension of it, but there would be an embodied kind of manifestation of it. We would actually somehow live it and act it in some ways. Okay, Akil.
Hi. Um, I think rationality was a pretty good value. I think the problem is not that rationality is bad. It's just that we are not very good at being rational. I think we are not very good holistic and long-term thinkers. So I think we need to just get better at applying rationality.
Got you. And I think there's also a real sense in which um, the truest sense of rationality, the very deepest sense, could be also, like a lack of ego and openness to change our minds, epistemic humility. And I think you're very right and I also, I mean, I don't know, I'm going to do justice to the quote. There's a great quote I know from Ian McGilchrist of like, I don't, I don't wish to kind of traduce reason. I don't wish to throw out reason, but I wish to integrate it with intuition and other things. It's not that I want to turn away from it completely. I simply want to not be reduced to kind of what we could call not like I don't know a kind of reductionist reason. So I think that's really, really true. We want a rich kind of reason. I also know Viveki and others talk very beautifully about rationality in that richer sense. Okay, is there anyone else who would like to share on this one? Like what the new? Oh, great, great, Sabra. That's wonderful. What would you like to share?
Yeah, I've been noticing that kind of the values inherent in feminine wisdom. And so just kind of like at some point, feminine wisdom was exiled from the field. And it feels like it's time for it to be called back in and us to kind of sort out like what are the qualities or the values inherent. And then another way of framing that, I feel like could be looking at poetic attunement as opposed to technological attunement. So this attunement to truth, beauty, and goodness, and just feeling like those are two ways of kind of pointing at the same thing, and the values are like in there.
I love it. And just to say, I have something I also really failed to do, and I'm a little bit, we have a young baby, so I'm a little bit sleep deprived sometimes at the moment. I should credit the many people who've contributed, by the way, Second Renaissance. One is also the person, my collaborator, actually life partner, but Sylvie and many others, James, many people who contributed. And also, I think you could tell the Second Renaissance website had a definitely artistic input, which is from others. So just to say there's an art of the Second Renaissance effort. Sylvie couldn't join tonight for that reason, but just to say there's many people, many hands, Lauren and many others who've contributed to this effort that I should acknowledge. And also why I say that is this point of how do we both have the reason, but integrate, as you say, the feminine or other dimensions of insight, understanding, the poetic, as well as the kind of classically rational. That's what I'm hearing, is that will be one part of the coming paradigm. Okay, so let me kind of go back for a moment. We'd say is that the next, just to kind of recap a little bit, if we're here, am I doing the right one? I want to do slideshow here. And so just to kind of where we go, we've come to the roots, the culture. So one of the things, by the way, that was kind of implicit in what we said, that we jump straight to like what the paradigm would look like. But I want to emphasize that, like the third noble truth of Buddha, he's saying liberation is possible. Like the third noble truth is simply like, hey, I've given you the bad news, which is, there's this suffering, there's a source of suffering, but I'm going to now tell you that actually you're not stuck with that. Liberation is available to us. And similarly here, if the source of the breakdown of this crisis lies in the core of our civilization and our cultural paradigm, well, that can change. It has changed in the past. Maybe what we're going through may be on a scale bigger than anything's happened before, I don't know. But one of the reasons we chose the name Second Renaissance was because it has this, at least historical resonance, that people have a sense of it. In the first Renaissance, we had this very significant shift, modernity was born. Now, maybe we've got lots of problems out of modernity, and no doubt when we get to a new paradigm, there will be problems again at some point. It will be a mountain with no top if we get there, if we survive to there. But we can evolve as a civilization. It has happened. 200 years ago, in almost no, at least complex society, you could say, or certainly no Western one, women did not have the vote. Women didn't have a lot of social, political power. And in 2 centuries, that has changed very significantly. Or in most countries around the world, 300 or 400 years ago, slavery was at least legal. I mean, you might say slavery still happens today, but most places it's not illegal, at least anyway. Chattel slavery no longer exists. And that reflected quite significant shifts in attitudes and views about other people, about ourselves. So we can evolve these things. And so the other thing I want to mention, though, is that there is also darkness before dawn often. This is a time of crisis, and there may be this darkness before dawn. Often that there is almost a breakdown, has been a precursor of deep cultural transformation. Modernity was born after the breakdown of the medieval civilization in Europe, at least the European Renaissance, and it was a period of great cultural rebirth. But for example, if you know your history, the 14th century in Europe, about a third to half of the European population died. There was a massive famine, and about 1/5 of the population died in about 1316 to 1320. And then, of course, there was the Black Death. So, for example, in Florence, which would be an epicenter of the Renaissance, about half of the population died during the Black Death. So it was a period of significant societal breakdown. And as I said, we want this new paradigm. Now, here's our suggestion on the Second Renaissance. If you looked at it, now I think there are many other views or values. These are not unique, and we could, as we've discussed, but some core ones that people already mentioned today was maybe a valuing or prioritization of the inner dimension, not necessarily a neglect entirely of the outer dimensions, but certainly a reprioritization of the inner. the value of kind of cultivation of wisdom based on the recognition of the limits and value of reason, of the importance of the whole and the value of the long term that includes all of the living, into being and interdependence, seeing clearly our profoundly interdependent relationship to each other and the planet, and we would say spirituality, or even I would say religion, like going beyond secularity to reintegrate spirituality and religion into collective life. Now that's a complex question. One of the I live in quite a bit of my time in France, and I literally got a leaflet from my son who's in school, who's 5 years old, about how laicity, like basically secularism, is a core value of the French Republic. You know, there must be no religious aspect of school and so on. And there's obviously was a great triumph in that in many ways because of sometimes the oppressive nature of religion and so on in the past. And then beyond capitalism, a new economic system which goes beyond that, ground in new ways to assess value. So I just gave a quote here, actually from Thich Nhat Hanh. I don't know if this is from the end of Love Letter to the Earth, if people know that book. And he says, humanity needs a new kind of spirituality. Sorry, needs a kind of spirituality that we can all practice together. Dogmatism and fanaticism have been the cause of great separation and war. In the 21st century, it will be possible to establish a cosmic religion based not on myth, belief, or dogma, but on the evidence and insight of interbeing. That was at least his aspiration there, and you know it's already happening. So what I want to look at here is then this is the kind of four noble beliefs analogy. So we've talked about the illness. We see these these escalating series of crises, interconnected crises. There's a source. The root of these is in the cultural paradigm of modernity, or more nuance in deep aspects of human maybe nature combined or exacerbated by the cultural paradigm of modernity. Greed did not start with capitalism. To example, it existed before, but it's maybe been transmuted or exacerbated or exaggerated its impact in modernity. Well-being is possible. There is cultural evolution is possible. We can evolve our thinking, feeling, acting, and being. And there is a path to well-being. So this is the kind of the four noble beliefs of the second Renaissance. Now, one of the things we've talked about 1, 2, and 3, and 4, 1, 2, and 3, but not 4, and I want to come to that. But one thing I also want to explain why this is also useful potentially to people when you are thinking of others, often in trying to share these ideas with other people, which some of you, I don't know here, you could put up your hand, have tried to do. Often people are different paths. So like one of the reasons of the teaching about, symptoms are often quite visible. There's clearly an increasing number of people who like recognize, hey, something seems to be quite up here. There's things going on that, doesn't, and I said we have evidence even, from large scale surveys that people increasingly realize that maybe the future isn't looking as bright as they thought it was and so on. But they might be, if they're here, you've got a kind of path, okay, well, what's the source of this? Then, okay, there's also hope. It's very crucial. Many people can be stuck in a moment of just cynicism and despair. It's hopeless. We will never address the climate crisis. We'll never address the ecological crisis. We'll never treat the biosphere with the love and respect and our sense of, communion that it deserves. We will never stop, killing or hating each other, or, polarization makes it impossible to engage in good faith discussion. It's very important to remember that while when the illness is serious, one can forget that well-being is possible, that transformation and profound transformation has happened in human history before. But what I want to take a moment for now is how the path to well-being. So, obviously the last noble truth in Buddhism is the Eightfold Path, right view, right thought, right speech, right action, and so on. What here, I would like you to give people about 5 minutes here to think about what are the kind of paths that would lead towards this new thing. What kind of things could we be doing concretely that would start to do that? Or how do you think that new world would start to come about? And I just want to plant the seed, which is when you look back at previous transformation. So the first Renaissance, for example, well, it didn't happen everywhere all at once. There were pockets. There was Florence, or later on, if you think of Protestantism, by the way, as a kind of modern form of Christianity in many ways, right? It's individualistic versus hierarchical and institutionalized in the Catholic Church and so on. It's much more democratic in many ways. Protestantism. Think of the Quakers as, you know, a pretty modern form of Christianity, you might say, modern, maybe even beyond modern. It happens in these pockets around places, for example. You know, there are other aspects of how when you see new paradigms emerge. So just to take 5 minutes here and brainstorm in your group, how, you know, what maybe actions you could be taking, or how do you think it would happen this new paradigm might emerge? What is the eightfold path of the Second Renaissance? And here I emphasize, I don't think there is one or an answer at the moment. This is very emergent, very speculative. So speculate.
I'll say many paths, but maybe one destination. And if we point at that destination with more beautiful world or wiser, weller world, or just love or awareness, or many words pointing in the same direction. But yes, many paths, many angles of approach to get there.
Very good. I want to say then briefly, I think there are 2 parts I want to emphasize. So one is in thinking about the eightfold path of the Second Renaissance, I want to echo what James just shared, which I don't think here there's one path. Just even, I would say, even in the destination, I think that there's a growing commonality, but there's probably emergent. It's not like at the beginning of modernity it was clear, and then maybe even in this paradigm there'll be obviously quite a bit of variation. But certainly in the past, there's going to be a lot of experimentation trying out. And it is worth having a hypothesis. This I would emphasize. It's kind of like if you don't have any thesis about what approach you're going to take, it's going to be hard to do anything effectively. It may turn out that the approach you take won't work. And I think there are certain principles we could look at about that. So just briefly, I think if people have, let me just again go here, just to go back, sorry, this is the summary of the Four Noble Beliefs, we can come back to that. But there's 2 white papers on secondrenaissance.net/paper, or if you just go to secondrenaissance.net. The first paper is like the what and kind of why. It's, you know, what is a Second Renaissance, and therefore basically the first 2 noble beliefs, and basically the beginning and the third one, that cultural evolution is possible, and this is what the paradigm might look like. The second paper, which I'd be interested in how many people have read, is how that could come about. And I would say emphasize that it's one thesis, but there are 2 parts that we suggest there. One is when you're trying to innovate in culture, you are going to do that in pockets, and it's quite intensive. Remember that you're normally embedded inside of a culture that isn't particularly hospitable to you. I mean, it's not necessarily trying to eliminate you as in the past, you know, like Protestants were expelled from France. It was pretty tough. But when you're trying to innovate in culture and being, you do want to be quite dense, you know, like the density of difference in order to do that. So you are going to probably have pockets. You do want to spend time in those kind of spaces. The second is about movement building. So the second contention is that you ultimately are trying to build, maybe network together these pockets and build a kind of alliance and a vision, a common vision about some things. Now that can be quite broad, but these 2 dimensions are probably common of what happens. And one can be, you know, more or less conscious of that, but those are 2 kind of principles of things. So I particularly emphasize this aspect of spending time in practice with others or around others. That doesn't mean being an echo chamber. One should confront the world at large, but these things take significant practice in that regard. So I think we're kind of coming. What I do want to say is that maybe this is one, like the winter is coming and so is spring point. Where we are at the moment, you know, there are several options. You know, there's several options where we could have the kind of optimistic vision is we'll avoid the system collapse. we'll avoid what we call the dark Renaissance, the dark age before the Renaissance. We'll just like zoom to like post-crisis renewal, where we, change in worldview and paradigm, or we'll be going through here. In our vision, obviously, the bad news, there'd be some really disastrous scenario, nanobots wipe us all out, or there's hothouse Earth or something, or there's even some issue, for example, we have a breakdown, we no longer have enough fossil fuel reserves to really reboot global civilization. That's the classic point, we don't have these free energy reserves accumulated over millions of years to kind of boot back up to build the solar panels. But leaving those to aside, in either case here, the second Renaissance or the efforts we're all making now, whatever you could put the term for them, are valuable. There's this kind of sanctuary and preservation model of like the monasteries during the dark ages of the Middle Ages, preserving wisdom and insight, or when option 3, it is valuable. So just to come back right to the beginning here, these phrases that we've all been familiar with, the great turning, integral, teal, metamentalism, metacrisis, etc., regenerative, that the second Renaissance, they capture something that modernity has run aground. Capitalism, if you like, I would say, is imploding in the face of the climate crisis. No one really believes at the moment in a broad way in alternatives. There's a great sense of despair and cynicism more broadly. You only need to go and look at what's on Netflix to discover where you are in your culture. Look at what is put out by your kind of culture making machine, if you like, in that case. And you just see the darkness and cynicism that is largely there in what is produced. And rather than replacement, we have a void. But there is possibility and hope. Transformation, transition is possible. There can be a new cultural social paradigm. It has happened before. And we are in a time of great danger and also great opportunity. Weiji, that Chinese word for crisis, by the way, contains these two ideograms, which mean danger and opportunity together. And that is the nature of a crisis. So we're at an inflection point. And what's really new here is we are in a meta crisis. That wasn't the case. We've had crisis before. It was the Second World War. There were deep issues we've had in the past. But the meta crisis, this breakdown at the roots, I mean, it has happened a few times before, but it's right now in the last 1,000 years, it's pretty major. And there's a return of the mystical. That's also a key aspect of this. And we're thinking a new kind of integration middle way. So to end, and by the way, I should just credit, obviously, we borrow the Second Renaissance term from Francisco Varela, his Ethical Know-How. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. To finish off our talk, if we just come back here, is if you take one thing with you, it's the 4 noble beliefs. If you know your Buddhism, that's one thing you can remember. And then we start to have a simple credo. What do we believe? We believe that there is polycrisis. We believe that it's a metacrisis. We believe that cultural evolution and transformation is possible. And we believe that the future might look a little bit like this. And there are some paths to it. So thank you so much. I know we've got 1 minute or now we're at time, but if people would like to check out, leave any words in the chat as you're leaving, just how you're leaving this session, whether it's enriched and exuberant or bewildered and bemused, whatever in between. It's been such a gift to have your presence here, and I hope your connection between each of you in the room. And please, the Second Renaissance Project, we need you. If you ever want to come and get involved, there are lots of ways to do so. Come along to secondrenaissance.net. I think there are ways to join in. There's a forum, there's other things. Get in touch. We'd love to hear from you and help spread the word and build this incredible broader field that's happening at Limicon and elsewhere. How do we make this dream and this vision known throughout the world? So thank you so much. Please leave your checkout in the chat and hope to see you at somewhere else at Limicon.
Revolution.
The revolution.
And yes, as James put in the chat, we have a Second Renaissance update on the 1st of April at 6 p.m. CET. I don't know what that is, Eastern time.
Yes.
Midday, I think.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Over and out.
Over and out. Thank you so much.
Thank you a lot.
See you on the other side. Then we'll see you
Bye,
first.
everyone.
Yeah,
Bye.
see you on the other side. Thank you so much.
Thanks, folks.
Lovely to see everybody.